All right, I got it started.
Okay, and if you want to take it away, or if you want me to make any introductions of yourself.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Thanks for attending the Zoom pond management workshop. Wes Goldsmith and I this morning recorded some segments out at a local park at a pond. We're going to cover about 8 or 9 topics with short videos, anywhere from 4 to 5 minutes on the videos. And between videos, we'll open it up for questions. If you have questions as we're going through the videos, just type those in chat if you want to, and Tom will read off the chat questions and we'll answer those. Wes is watching the program. He doesn't have audio, but he said he could type in any comments and we can share those from chat also. So what we're basically, our setup this morning was we took about 8 or 9 of the most commonly asked questions for pond management, and we covered those. And the first and foremost is a lot of people call in when it comes to fish management. They say, you know, hey, I need to stock my pond. So let's see what Wes has to share with us about that question. Should I stock my pond, and what do I need to do? So.
Hi everyone, I'm Wes Goldsmith. I'm with Aquatic Control. I'm our lead fisheries biologist there, and today we're going to cover some frequently asked questions about fish management kind of stuff is what I'll cover, and Dave's going to cover more of the plant management, algae kind of stuff. So the first topic that I'm going to cover is stocking. So we get a lot of calls. Dave and I both get a lot of calls about you know, what should we stock in our pond? Everybody likes to stock fish, even when they already have an established pond. And so the first thing to think about with this topic is this a needed management tool at this time? And so a lot of times stocking isn't always necessary. What you'll want to do is go fish in your pond and see what the dynamics of your pond are. And a lot of times you can alter your fishery by harvesting fish instead of actually stocking. Now, what I will say is if you're in a really unbalanced situation where you have a lot of really small bass that are in the same size class and they're really skinny, and you have a lot of bluegill that are bigger, you don't have any kind of middle-sized class bluegill, those are scenarios where stocking can help. But again, you can start to harvest some of those bass and try to transition. Stocking is something that could potentially speed that up. And so a lot of people want to stock fathead minnows, golden shiners in this scenario, which is good, but a lot of times if it's not worked in with other management tools, they're going to get eaten pretty quickly. So when we get a client who is interested in speeding things up and wants to stock, a lot of times we'll actually stock a few extra bluegill and then make sure the rest of their program, as far as habitat and fish management and harvest and all those kind of things are, you know, on the right track as well. Stocking is only one piece of the puzzle. You're not going to Hi everyone, I'm Wes Goldsmith. I'm with Aquatic Fish, even when they already have an established pond. And so the first thing to think about with this topic is this a needed management tool at this time? And so a lot of times stocking isn't always necessary. What you'll want to do is go fish in your pond and see what the dynamics of your pond are. And a lot of times you can alter your fishery by harvesting fish instead of actually stocking. Now, what I will say is if you're in a really unbalanced situation where you have a lot of really small bass that are in the same size class and they're really skinny, and you have a lot of bluegill that are bigger, you don't have any kind of middle-sized class bluegill, those are scenarios where stocking can help, but again, you can start to harvest some of those bass and try to transition. Stocking is something that could potentially speed that up. And so a lot of people want to stock fathead minnows, golden shiners in this scenario, which is good, but a lot of times if it's not worked in with other management tools, they're going to get eaten pretty quickly. So when we get a client who is interested in speeding things up and wants to stock, a lot of times we'll actually stock a few extra bluegill and then make sure the rest of their program, as far as habitat and fish management and harvest and all those kind of things are, on the right track as well. Stocking is only one piece of the puzzle. You're not going to, solve every issue just by throwing more fish in there. A lot of times people, we find, actually compound their issues by putting more fish in their pond. So this scenario I'm talking about with a lot of small bass, occasionally we get people who think they need to change their genetics or something along those lines, so they actually put in more bass. And so what that's doing is adding more competition to a problem where there's already a lack of food out there for those predators. The other scenario is where you have very few bass and they're growing pretty well, but you have way too many bluegill and your bluegill aren't growing very well. So in that scenario, you definitely don't want to throw more bluegill at it or put more forage as far as those fatheads and golden shiners. It's not really helping you. It could be hurting your bluegill population. In that scenario, if you were to stock something, you might want to do a very low bass stocking. But again, you really just want to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in your pond. Call one of us, something like that, and because stocking can get you in a lot of times more trouble than help if you do the wrong thing and stock the wrong fish.
Okay, are there any questions about stocking fish?
I don't see any questions in the chat, Dave.
Okay. Sorry about, I found out you cannot touch your mouse in the middle of a video or you start it over. So that was my mistake. So let's go on to the next video. Feeding fish. What should we do when people ask us about feeding fish?
Another common question we get is, what do we need to feed our fish? Is it required to feed our fish? That kind of thing. So this is another one where it kind of depends on your situation and what your goals are for that fishery. When you're looking at stocking, you can actually, feed your fish as far as your predators go by stocking more forage. So that could be fathead minnows, golden shiners, bluegill if it needs it. But a lot of times what people are, when they think of feeding their fish, they're thinking of a pelleted food that they either toss in or they set up an automatic fish feeder, and it shoots that fish food out there a couple times a day. And so is it required? No, it's definitely not. You can, several ponds don't do any kind of supplemental feed like that, but it can certainly help in several different situations. What you're actually doing when you're feeding fish, a lot of times if you ever start to feed, not all of your fish are going to come start to hit those pellets. The fish you're going to be actually feeding and giving that extra protein to are going to be your bluegill, and if you have catfish, your catfish a lot of times are going to come up and scoop up a lot of that food. Unless you have tons of aggressive bluegill, sometimes they can kind of keep the catfish at bay. So keep in mind before you start feeding your fish, your bass aren't going to come hit that feed. It's your crappie aren't going to do anything like that. You're going to be feeding your bluegill, which is the most beneficial, and if you have catfish, they're going to come up and find it as well. Now, the benefit of feeding your fish is increasing and supplementing your forage base, as in your bluegill. Your bluegill are going to be your most important forage fish in your pond. That's what's going to feed, all your bass, any other predators that you might have in there, because they're going to reproduce and create the food for those fish that are looking, for smaller fish to eat. So by feeding your fish and increasing that food source for them, you're essentially increasing the carrying capacity a little bit of your pond. And so you're adding that extra food source that they can come up and utilize. And so when you do something like this, I always tell people there's two different reasons to feed your fish. One reason that we see, often is, grandma or grandpa or someone that has young kids coming to the pond a lot. They don't really care too much about the fish growth and trying to manage it strategically. They just like to throw fish out, watch the fish come up, boil at the surface, and it's kind of a cool thing that they can, show the kids and that kind of thing. If you're going to do something like that, you don't have to invest a ton of money in a feeder or, some of the more expensive foods. But if you're actually looking to manage your pond, see, increased growth in your bluegill and the management strategy behind that, you want to look at a few different ingredients, a few different things that are in those foods before you decide what you want to go with. Protein percentage is going to be a big one. Some of the higher ones on the market, one that we carry is 40% protein. You can go all the way down to, some of the cheapest stuff is going to be only 15%, something like that. Other things you want to look at is the ingredients list. Is there a lot of filler? Just like in a food that you get from the grocery store, they list those ingredients based on what's, the highest percentage in that food is going to be listed first. So if you look there and the fish food says fish meal or something along those lines where the actual protein is coming from a fish, those are going to be your higher class fish foods. Your lower class are going to list things such as wheat, soy, different plant-based materials that are going to contain some protein, but it's not exactly what the fish needs to metabolize and, result into better growth. So those are kind of the couple things you want to look for, and, you want to keep in mind what your goals are for the pond, and that's going to kind of lead you to where you want to land on what you're paying for your fish food and what you're going to get out of it. And just to reiterate again, what you're accomplishing by doing something like this, especially when you use the higher class, high protein fish foods, is you're increasing your forage base. So when your bluegills start to grow, you're going to get a bigger crop of bluegill that grow to larger sizes. And then when they go to spawn, those bigger fish, and this is across the board on any fish, the bigger the fish is, the bigger their eggs are, the healthier their eggs are when they go to spawn. And so you're going to have increased reproduction. And again, you're raising the carrying capacity of your pond. So you're providing more food that works its way up the food web into your predators. So you're not only going to be able to create, larger panfish, but it's actually going to benefit your predators as well, such as your largemouth bass, anything else you have in there.
Okay, any questions on the chat or anything about feeding fish?
No questions there. Did you say Wes doesn't have audio, he just has the ability to answer in chat?
Yeah, he said he'll watch the chat room.
Yeah, okay, cool.
So, all right, so harvesting fish. One of the things that people do not do well enough in most of their pond situations that I visit is harvest enough fish and keep those fish actively growing. So Wes is going to share some insights on fish harvest.
Another one of the big questions that comes up a lot, and sometimes this is something that, me or Dave have to introduce to a customer, is harvest. Harvesting your fish is extremely important when managing your pond. We do a lot of fish surveys with the electrofishing boat. Dave takes a lot of calls, goes to these properties. And one of the first things that I always ask people, even before we get started, are you harvesting any fish? Are you taking any out? And a lot of times, more often than not, they say, oh, we might take a few out, but generally we're throwing all the bass back. We're throwing, a lot of the fish back. We don't want to, we don't want to take too many out. In a small system like these ponds, especially in Indiana where our water is very fertile, has a lot of nutrients, we're producing a lot of fish. They're spawning every year. Harvest is a really big key to getting where you want to go with your pond. And so there's a couple different scenarios that we run into where you want to focus your harvest on one species or the other, so I'll touch on that. And then when you're in a balanced situation, you really want to be harvesting both bass and bluegill. So the two extremes that we see a lot that show up when there's very little management, we usually see one of these two scenarios. The first is a bunch of small bass that are skinny, all about the same size. They don't appear to be growing very well. They're really typically easy to catch for anglers, and every one you pull out is a cookie cutter. They're the same, look like the same fish almost. The other scenario, and in that scenario with the overabundant bass, your bluegill population, typically you have a small population of, pretty large bluegill. They can get 8 to 9 inches or even bigger, but there's not always a ton of them, and you're never catching anything in that, 4 to 6 inch range, which is really what those bass need to be eating. As they're growing bigger, they need to be eating smaller bluegill, to increase their size. And so in that scenario, they've essentially run out of food to eat. And when the bluegill spawn, the small fish come off the nest, and the bass are eating them when they're extremely small, a couple inches, and they really just don't get any benefit out of eating a fish that small. They need to be eating, bigger bluegill, something almost as big as they can fit in their mouth, and that's where they're going to get the benefit from all that energy and put that towards growth. So in that scenario, you want to really focus your harvest on your bass. So, and you can, leave your bluegill alone for a few years while you let your bluegill population rebound. And so in that scenario, you want to be taking out at least 20 pounds per acre of your largemouth, if not more. In a balanced situation, we usually start around 15 to 20. In an overabundant population, we're usually trying to take out, as much as we can for the first couple years and see if we're seeing any improvement there. Now, the other situation that we run into is kind of the opposite. And so when you go bass fishing, you don't always catch a lot of them, but the ones you do are different sizes, and they're really plump, they're growing well, but your catch rates are, fairly low. And then when you go bluegill fishing, you're catching bluegill every single cast. They're all about the same size. They could, all 6 inches, all 5 inches, and I've seen it all the way down in really extreme scenarios in small ponds where they're stunted at, 3.5 inches, which is, very, very extreme. But in that scenario, you want to harvest as many bluegill as you can and potentially increase your predator population to help you do that. So the way you get to that scenario, when the bass go to spawn in the spring, the bluegill don't have very much food because there's so much competition. And so they're going to start to kind of raid the largemouth bass spawning beds to eat their eggs, their larval fish, as an extra food source. And so your bass recruitment, ends up really low. And as that goes on over time, your bass population starts to whittle its way down to a pretty small population. So when you're in this scenario, your harvest rate, you want to be, we'll take up 500 bluegill or more per surface acre. And again, when you're in a really extreme scenario, it can help to just throw a few extra bass in there, get them, stocked from a hatchery, just to help them do that work for you. And then you can take as many out as you can, and eventually, through your harvest, you're going to see improvements. Now, in more of a balanced population where you're catching several different size classes of largemouth bass and several different size classes of bluegill, you'll know that you're kind of in a balanced situation. And to keep it in that scenario where you're getting good growth out of both populations, you want to harvest from both populations. So like I said, largemouth you can take out to 20 pounds per acre sometimes, and that's going to keep their competition down and let the rest of those fish have enough food to continue to grow. And then bluegill, you can still take out a bunch of bluegill. You can, sometimes take out 400 to 500 bluegill per surface acre in a productive pond. And I know that sounds like a lot, but bluegill are spawning 3 to 4 times a year or more. As long as your water temperature is above a certain level, they're going to continue to spawn. Different fish are going to keep moving up every month around the full moon, and so they're reproducing every year, where your largemouth are only spawning in the spring. So the bluegill, it takes a lot more harvest to keep them, thinned out and growing well. So just keep in mind that harvest is really important. You want to kind of figure out through fishing or an electrofishing survey where you're at right now, and then kind of come up with a game plan. Do we need to focus more on our largemouth, more on our bluegill, or do we think we're in a balanced situation where we should be taking some of both out?
Okay, any questions about harvest?
We do have a question in chat that Wes put in there. He said, Dave, we didn't really cover anything about crappie. Can you give your spiel on crappie and talk about how important harvest is when crappie are present in a pond?
Yeah, crappie are direct competitors with largemouth bass. But I'm one of those that if you love crappie and you want to catch and eat crappie, then you have crappie in there. But crappie are a lot like bluegill. Once crappie are established, you want to keep a lot of crappie and eat a lot of crappie. A good rule of thumb in bluegill, crappie fisheries, especially where you got them both, is when you catch one, you never throw it back. Most people don't fish their ponds enough. So crappie is one of those that will directly compete with largemouth bass. So if you're going to put crappie in, just know that they're going to take some of the growth potential away from largemouth. But I got a lot of people that love to catch and eat crappie, and if that's what you've got a lake for, then by all means have crappie in there. But crappie are, just know they're competitive with your largemouth. So let's look at water quality and aeration. A lot of people that have a lot of fish management, a lot invested in their fish, they really got to understand one of the insurance things that we can do for our pond is aeration. So let's look at what Wes has to say about aeration.
Another question we get is water quality, and something that kind of goes along with that is aeration, which is really something that every pond owner should consider. A lot of times it comes down to, how far away is an electric source? What are your goals for the pond? Are you really trying to do some strategic management, that kind of thing? But I'll quickly explain, what aeration is and what that can look like, and then, what are the benefits of that moving forward long-term and all that kind of stuff. So aeration, essentially what we're trying to achieve is adding oxygen, increasing your oxygen in the water column, and, keeping it spread out through your pond. So there's 2 different forms of aeration. You can do a bottom diffused aeration, which is the best if you're in the right scenario. You have to have a certain depth. The other scenario, or other option I should say, is surface aeration, which essentially just looks like a fountain. And so, there's several different kind of fountains. There's decorative fountains that shoot a small stream of water up into the air. Those kind of things aren't really going to add too much oxygen to your water. They're not going to, I wouldn't hardly call them an aeration. They're more decorative, for people to look at and enjoy. Now that scales all the way down to something that, still essentially is a fountain, but it's moving a tremendous amount of water. It may only, come out of the surface of the water a few feet, but it's, creating ripples across the pond. It's moving a huge volume of water. And so that is increasing the oxygen in that top layer, which is beneficial. Now, the way you decide which, option is right for you is all based on depth and the layout, of the bottom of your pond. And so if you have a depth of 8 feet or more, you should go with diffused aeration. Anything less than that starts to get pretty tricky. Anything under 6, it's essentially not going to be an option at all. And the reason for that is what diffused aeration is doing is you're going to put a diffuser at the bottom. You're going to look for the deepest portions of your lake. And while I'm thinking about it, this is definitely something that you're going to want professional help with, making sure that you're getting this size correctly. Because if you undersize a diffused aeration system, it can actually do more harm than good for your pond. So keep that in mind when you're considering this kind of stuff. So those diffusers are going to go in the deepest parts of your pond or lake. Based on the size, we can figure out how many different diffusers you need. And what that's going to do is basically pushing a plume of bubbles to the surface at each one of those locations where that diffuser is. And what those bubbles are doing is pushing water from the bottom all the way to the top. And what we're trying to achieve is the water in your pond to circulate a full circulation. All the water at some point in a 24-hour day is going to go to the surface and back down. We're trying to do a full rotation one time in 24 hours. And so what that does is gives us oxygen from top to bottom. Now, you may already assume that that's the case, but in the summer months, what happens in a pond and even large lakes is you get something called a thermocline. And what that is that there's 2 different layers of water in your pond or lake. The top layer, the sun, the warm weather, is going to heat up very quickly, and the bottom layer gets separated from that warm layer, and it's actually pretty cool. It can have a pretty big difference in temperature. The way I always explain this to people is if you've ever went swimming in a farm pond or something and you swim out to the middle and your feet are in really cold water and the top of the water is, very warm, obviously. A lot of times what people think is that's why everyone says their pond is spring-fed, right? Most people's ponds aren't spring-fed. What they're feeling there is that their feet are below the thermocline. And so in that colder water layer is essentially no oxygen. That top layer is less dense, so it comes to the surface, and that cold layer sinks to the bottom. And everything that's decomposing, whether it's, algae, any weeds that come and die off, all that kind of stuff is decomposing on the bottom. And when that stuff decomposes, it pulls oxygen out of the water. But that thermocline keeps those 2 layers separated. And so the top of your water, where a lot of your planktonic algae, your weeds, when that stuff photosynthesizes and just being, next to the atmosphere, it's getting oxygen. That top layer has oxygen, and that lower layer is not mixed, and it has essentially 0 oxygen. And so your fish can't go utilize that portion of the lake in that scenario, which is in basically everybody's pond throughout the summer months. It happens everywhere. So what we're accomplishing by adding aeration to especially bottom diffused aeration is we're getting rid of that thermocline. We're mixing the lake, and oxygen is now from the top all the way to the bottom throughout your entire pond. And so that's important for, several different reasons. One, if you just think about it, as far as your fish goes in the habitat, in the summer months, all of your fish essentially in a small pond are in 4 foot of water or less because they have to be. There's no oxygen below that thermocline. They can't go down there because they can't breathe, essentially. And so by adding that diffuser and putting oxygen to the top to the bottom, those fish have a tremendous more habitat, essentially, more room to spread out and utilize everything in your pond throughout the whole year. Other benefits of aeration, by adding oxygen to the bottom and the muck along the bottom, you're increasing the rate at which that organic matter is decomposed. So the good bacteria, when you get oxygen down to the bottom, they're going to start processing some of that organic material, and over time, you know, depending on the situation, sometimes you can see, you know, a little less muck over time, or at minimum, you can, you know, slow down the aging process of your pond as it fills in and gets more organic material. That aeration, having oxygen down there, is going to allow it to, you know, process some of that organic material as it comes in. So again, aeration is something to always think about. It just kind of comes down to what are the costs to get electric down to your pond to run something like this, and what are you trying to achieve? But it benefits, you know, every body of water that it goes into.
Okay, any questions about fish management before we get started with the plant portion?
Dave, there's no other questions in chat other than that Wes and I were kind of chatting privately that I asked him, and he said I could absolutely share it. I said, what would be a ballpark price, or what is the charge for a shocker boat to come and do a survey of someone's pond and lake? And you know, the best way is to go do the fishing, but say, again, you want to kind of get a more comprehensive. And he says anything less than 10 acres is around $1,200. So I'm not sure if everybody knows or if they've seen that process, but you might just want to say how, you know, shocker boat going out there, they put a battery electric charge, they temporarily stun the fish, they'll float to the surface and kind of do a quick count of them that away and kind of a survey in different locations around the pond or the lake.
Yeah, yeah, they do a good job with writing recommendations, not only from the fish side, but while they're there, they can also look at the plant community and all that. So you can get a pretty comprehensive plan when they come out and look at your pond. So, you know, it's absolutely a good service. A lot of landowners, if they just buy a pond and don't really know what's going on with the pond, it's not a bad idea to get a baseline of where you are. So, okay. So let's start the plant portion, plant management, and we'll just watch the video.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Zoom Pond Workshop. Wes and I have done these workshops for several years now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask John, if he would, to just kind of pan around the lake real slow while I'm talking. And what I want you to look at is we're at Gladys Russell Park here in Dearborn County. It's a natural lake, and when we get called to lakes and lake issues, we walk into a lake just like we did this morning, and we look at different situations. And what we're looking at is a lot of different things. And if some of you can see on the water, we've got kind of a green haze or a green, you know, people will call it a scum or, you know, things like that. What that green is actually kind of a combination. It's mostly water meal today. A lot of ponds this time of year have had planktonous algae blooms, and so that green scum may be a planktonous algae bloom. It can be duckweed, lots of different things. And then once this green kind of goes away, a lot of people will see their pond get brown or almost a coffee color. All this aquatic vegetation is important to a pond ecosystem. I'm going to tell you this right off the top from the plant community side of things and the plant management. If you want a swimming pool, build a swimming pool. And I say that to always start my weed talk in, because the weeds, the vegetation, all that in a pond is habitat. Wes has already talked to you about fish management and population management and things like that, but the habitat in a pond is created by plant life. And if we have a pond devoid of plant life, so it looks like a swimming pool, it's clean and clear like a swimming pool, you can throw your fish growth right out the window. You can throw what Wes told you kind of right out the window, because you don't have the basis of the food web, the food chain, and that's habitat, that's structure. Most of our ponds, a lot of our ponds in southeast Indiana are bowls. They were dug as bowls. They don't have a lot of cover in them. And so the cover that's created, if you saw as we panned around, we saw cattails, we saw willows, we saw trees, we saw a lot of things that create shade. Shade's important for small organisms, small minnows, insect larvae, laying eggs for insects. All those things, feed the pond ecosystem and the management. So that's important. That habitat and weed growth. Our goal at the end of the day is not to eliminate all the weeds in a pond. That creates a swimming pool. You're going to be much happier if you wanted a swimming pool to build you one. So let's talk about what we're going to do. Is I'm going to start the first little session here talking about what I get called on the most, and that's algae. And most of it's filamentous algae. It's that algae that in the spring comes up and forms a mat over the top of the water. It's a real bright green color. It sticks on your fishing lure every cast. You can't even get a bobber in the water because it sticks to that as an algae. And I get a lot of people say, hey, I've been treating my algae, but I'm not having any luck. And I ask, what were you treating it with? And they're talking about reward or glyphosate or things like that. Well, algae is different. It's not your typical plant, and it doesn't succumb to typical herbicides like other plants do. The main treatment for algae are copper products. The old copper sulfate can be used. I'm not a fan of copper sulfate in southeast Indiana. We have hard water in southeast Indiana, and we can actually get some hard water issues with copper sulfate if we don't do it right. Cutrine Plus, C-U-T-R-I-N-E. Cutrine is a product that I like to recommend to homeowners because it's got a huge safety margin. It's not really toxic to fish in a hard water situation. So treating algae, we're looking at copper products, and we're looking at getting on that algae early in the season. Let's get that algae under control. The algae is there because we have nutrients, okay? It's pure and simple, phosphorus. When we get phosphorus in a pond situation, in a water situation, something's going to grow in that nutrient. So algae is the first one, and algae blooms come because of the high nutritional value, the high levels of phosphorus. This year in 2020, with all the rain we've had over 12 inches of rain in Ripley County in the last 30 days. Those all are bringing nutrients into a pond where the water temperatures are in the 80s. It's a perfect scenario for planktonous algae blooms. That's kind of that other green slime that you might be seeing. Planktonous algae is hard to treat with copper. I don't ever recommend you treating your algae in your pond between about 4th of July and Labor Day as a landowner. And the reason I don't is exactly what Wes talked about with the aeration and the stratification of ponds. If we add and kill a bunch of aquatic vegetation in a stratified pond, we increase that stratification. We decrease that oxygen. So if you're going to treat during that time of year, you need somebody to come in and kind of give you a scenario of how that works. So algae, we've got the planktonous algae, which is the single cell. We've got the filamentous algae. We've got some algae, bultrous algae. We've got some mat-forming algae that forms on the bottom of the pond. Sometimes you see it coming up, looks like pancakes in the spring. We've also got a hair-like algae called chara. A lot of people think chara is actually a moss, and it's actually an algae. So they treat with a reward or a diquat or something like that, and they have no success. So really boiling down and knowing what weeds we have really play a game into what treatment works and what treatment's effective. So our algae treatment, we're looking at copper products. There is a new class of product on the market that is a herbicide. It's called Clipper, was the first one to come out. Now there's some other products because I think they've lost their copyright or their trade deal on that. So that Clipper has become Propeller, and some other companies have got some other products like that. So that is a herbicide that actually has some algal control. And so you want to read the labels, you want to know what plant you've got, and you want to treat for the right thing at the right time.
So any question about algae?
Sorry, Dave, I'm a slow typer, but Cheryl was typing in, please spell the Cutrine plus, and she actually spelled it correctly, C-U-T-R-I-N-E plus.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah, and Cutrine can come as a liquid if you've got a sprayer and want to use a sprayer, or it comes in a granular. And I like the granular because you can just take a small cup, you know, wear a pair of gloves and go out on those algal mats and actually just spread that granular right on top of the algal mat as a spot treatment, and it's very effective as a spot treatment that way. I think people will really like Cutrine when they get used to how they use it, and in our hard water, it's much safer. So, any other questions? So we're going to go into emergent weeds next.
So algae was the first thing we looked at. Now we're going to look at our emerged weeds. And if you looked at when we panned around, we've got cattails, we've got some slender rush, we've got things like lily pads and things like that. So our emergent weeds, we're looking at a contact class of herbicides, kind of like glyphosate is one of the main ones. But you want to use an aquatic version of glyphosate. You know, there's AquaPro, several companies out there, Rodeo, things like that. And what people don't understand sometimes is they'll get a glyphosate product or they'll look at Ruocane, glyphosate's a whole lot cheaper. Well, you really need to look at your label because all glyphosate, the molecule glyphosate is the same molecule. The trick is, do we get that molecule into the plant? And some of these products that seem to be a lot more expensive on the front end are fully loaded, what they call. They've got all the surfactants, they've got all the stickers and wetters already included. And some of the cheaper forms of glyphosate don't have any of that. So you need to buy the surfactants and things like that. So you really need to read the label and look at the label because these aquatic plants live in an aquatic environment. So water doesn't just get in that plant. If it did, they would all become soggy and fall over and die, and we would never have a problem with aquatic plants. So we're using water to try to get a chemical inside an aquatic plant. We have to have the surfactants and things like that. That is as important or maybe more important than the chemistry that we're actually using. So our emerged weeds, things like that, we've got to kind of understand their biology a little bit. Cattails put all their energy in the spring and summer upward. They're trying to put that cattail, that seed head on. They're generating that seed head. So if we kill that plant or we try to put herbicide on that plant, we can get top kill. We can burn off the tops, but we're getting very little of a systemic product like glyphosate to the root system. In the fall, that plant turns around and puts all of its energy down in the root system, and we get a lot better results with long-term control with a fall application. And what I like to see people do is a fall apply on things like cattail, slender rush, willow, things like that. And then when they sprout back in the spring and they're small, get on them again when those plants are small. This is not unlike ag or our yard or anything else. These chemicals are made to treat small plants. The bigger the plant gets, the less effective these are. So for our emerged weeds, we're looking at contact herbicides. And there's several out there on the market. Just make sure you're reading the label for your contact herbicide and that it's fully loaded so that we're getting this product inside the plant.
So any question about emergent weeds?
Again, Dave, I'm kind of a slow typist, but Cheryl said how to best identify algae that we have. So I was telling her about the Purdue publication, the APM-3-W, has all the pictures and control recommendations. And I put a free copy out, and I put the link to the Purdue publication.
Right. That publication has pictures. There are pictures on the internet. If you type in filamentous algae, there's some apps out there that you can get on aquatic weeds. So all those resources are good. If you pick it up and it's stringy, kind of hairy looking, you're talking about filamentous algae. And that's the most common that we deal with.
And then Carrie was also asking about what was the other product for algae. So I was just looking not only the copper sulfates, but the indithol K or the...
Oh, there's an aquathol. There are some other liquid algicides. And some of those you need to look at what the application process is. Do you need a sprayer? Do you need an injector to inject it in the water system? And so, with some of those different products come a little bit different application technique. But there are some other algicides on the market. I just simply covered the cutrine and the copper products that are the most common. So.
Yes, that was all then. Thanks.
Okay, so now we're going to look at the floating. I believe that's what we're at now.
All right, so the next class we're going to look at is the floating. As you see the green haze out here, like I said, in the introduction, this is watermeal. If you look close to the bank, there's also duckweed. Watermeal and duckweed are floating weeds, floating things that generally reproduce asexually. They just multiply, they just split themselves, and they're actually there in that warm surface layer of water using the nutrients that we talked about. Watermeal is the toughest floating weed that we have to control. Matter of fact, a lot of our products say that they will kind of keep them in check. They'll keep them from reproducing, but they'll fall short of saying that they control watermeal. A couple of the products that work well for watermeal and duckweed, the top in the Cadillac is Sonar or Floridone. And Sonar is a trade name. Floridone now has a couple different companies that have Floridone products. But that still will say on the label watermeal, it only keeps it suppressed for the season. But if we get that Floridone in the water system early in March, it can keep the pond from covering over with those floating weeds like watermeal and duckweed. But here's the caveat of Floridone. It can be between $1,200 and $1,800 an acre. It's not cheap. And we need to maintain through the season a certain parts per million, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, parts per billion, in your water column to be effective for the season-long control. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about submerged plants here in a minute. But the reason I say that's important is if you've got a pond where you have a 4-inch rain and water goes over your spillway and it dumps half of your pond volume out your spillway and you just spent $1,800 for Floridone and a week later you get a 4-inch rain, your Floridone just went down the stream and somewhere else, and now you don't have enough Floridone in the pond to do what you paid for season-long control. So if you've got a pond situation like that, a lot of times, and talking to some of the biologists and the weed guys at Aquatic Control a couple months ago, they're recommending in a situation like that, wait until the water situation kind of equalizes out. The pool comes down in the summer, so you're not losing a lot of water, and they may actually put a split application of Floridone in. They put it in the spring, but not the whole $1,800 worth, and then they wait until the water becomes a little more consistent. They're not going to lose a lot of water, and they'll put another split treatment out there. You still have the same cost involved, but you're going to retain some more of that chemical and get a little more season-long control. So if you've got a pond that's got a lot of water inflow and you're wanting to treat watermeal and duckweed and things like that, then you're looking at Floridone, maybe look at a split treatment in our ponds in southeast Indiana. The product I talked about, Clipper, which is also Propeller, it's that class of chemical. It has some good activity on duckweed and watermeal too. But a lot of times you see, we're here in August and we've got this water meal. Again, that's between July 4th and Labor Day, and our ponds are really stratified this time of year. Lots of things going on in the pond to lose oxygen, hot conditions, 90-degree days, things like that. If I was going to treat a pond and you really said, I got to treat this, I got to do something, I'm going to let a breeze blow and get all this stuff blown into one little cove or one little area, and I'm going to treat smaller areas. I'm not going to treat a whole pond type of situation. So there are some different treatments. There's some different chemicals like the clipper. Fluoridone's the kind of the go-to if you want some season-long control. Really probably looking at a split application. But there are some other products that can work and show some effect. Duckweed's pretty easy. There's lots of different products that'll take care of duckweed. Water meal's the tough one. But if you look at this pond, the question is, do I need to treat it for water meal? And a lot of landowners will say, oh, that looks horrible. I got to treat it because it looks horrible. From a habitat perspective, I'm here to tell you that water meal is not doing a thing to this pond, other than maybe creating some oxygen on the surface, creating a place for small minnows to find insect larvae who are going to come up and kind of ride around on the little mats and things like that. So you've got to kind of weigh what you can put up with as a pond owner. If you want it clean, you're going to pay more to clean it. But just because it always looks like this doesn't mean I have to do something to that. Mother Nature is going to take care of this pond as the water temperatures come back down in the fall. So if I'm going to treat a pond and I want it to look good for the season, I'm going to get on it early in the spring. I'm going to spend my money in the spring. Mother Nature is going to take care of these things once we get into September or October. And I'm not a big fan of treating a lot of things. There are things like cattails we talked about. We want to do a fall application, but in the water column and things like that, a lot of those weeds are big enough and far advanced enough in their growth stage that we're not going to do a lot to them. Let's get them next spring.
Okay, Dave.
Any question on the floating weeds?
Yeah, Christine asks, are there any organic options / methods of plant control?
Yeah, the couple of the organic methods would be a couple of the fish that will utilize those as feed. One would be grass carp. Grass carp do a good job for the first few years until they get big and old and sluggish, kind of like I am, and they don't do as much. So every 6 or 8 years on grass carp, you probably want to take them out and replace them. They're not a standalone silver bullet, but they can control some of that. And we're playing around the last 3 summers. I've played around with tilapia, and tilapia will eat those weeds and those types of things too. So from an organic perspective, you can use fish like that. You can also use skimmers, and you can use weed cutters and things like that, and you can actually physically remove a lot of pond weeds to manage them through a physical removal of those weeds. So that doesn't interject any chemicals to the pond situation and things like that. So if you're not shy about going out and cutting the weeds and dragging the weeds out and raking them out of a pond, you can actually physically remove weeds and get pretty good control for a short period. A lot of times though, when we pull mosses and different weeds out of the bottom of a pond, we can stimulate growth. So we can actually stimulate growth. We stir up the bottom a little bit, which releases some nutrients and things like that. So everything we do in a pond situation kind of has ramifications for something else. So when we pull those weeds out, those root systems will sprout back, and sometimes they'll sprout back with a little bit heavier weed growth because we've unleashed some nutrients and things like that. But those are some of the more natural, non-chemical ways we can look at treating some of these weeds.
And I'd also add, Dave, a while ago, whenever you were saying about wait till that water meal or whatever blows into the cove or over to one side, I'm thinking that's a lot of way to get rid of some of that floating algae and stuff too.
Right. Algal mats, in the spring, one of the really tricks about algal mats is to treat those early enough in the afternoon that cutrine or copper sulfate can dissolve and do what it does before it gets dark and before that green plant turns around and starts to respirate. Sometimes we get home from work and we do it right before dark, and we actually lose some of the effectiveness of some of these chemicals because the plant is not actively growing and doing what it does because we put it into a dark situation. So most of our chemical applications we want to do on fairly calm days, warm days, not cold spells, not when the water's, shocked these plants by being cold and they're not actively growing, but actively growing plants with enough daylight left that plant can uptake that chemical and get it into its system.
And I'll just go back to have everyone refer to that Aquatic Pest Management Pub. That'll have a lot of good other info in it too.
Yep.
One other thing, Dave, from Wes makes that a good point, that maybe you're still planning to cover it with some more of your section here on talk, but need to definitely mention to folks about needing to read the label carefully and to know that there are some restrictions on using some of the different chemicals.
Yeah, especially if we're swimming, if we're irrigating out of a pond, if we're watering livestock or pets could drink out of the pond, you definitely want to read the label to see what restrictions. Anytime we use a chemical, we want to know, can I swim right away, or should it be 2 days before I swim? Can I water the garden and tomatoes out of it? Tomatoes are one of those extremely sensitive plants. And so if there was a tomato in your garden, it's going to be sensitive to some of these herbicides. It could be tomatoes. So yeah, definitely read the label to see if there is any water use restrictions anytime we apply chemicals to our ponds.
Okay, that's all I had.
All right, so let's look at the last group of weeds, and we're talking about the submerged weeds.
All right, the last class of plants we're going to talk about are those that are under the surface that we don't see. They might send a flower spike up every once in a while that we see them just stick their heads out at the surface, but the main plant is under the water. They're a rooted plant. They're kind of like the naiads and the pond weeds and the milfoil and things like that. Some of those terms, if you're a bass fisherman, you go, oh, I love those. I love milfoil. I love throwing, because the fish are there. Well, why are they there? Well, that's a green plant producing oxygen in the warm time of the year. Lots of small insect larvae. Minnows are feeding on the insect larvae, and they're there to feed on. They're a predator. The reason people like to fish those kind of things is because it's habitat. We talked about that before. So if you have those submerged plants in a pond, having some of that is very, very good for the health of a pond. You've got to determine as a landowner, pond owner, how much can you deal with? And if we're going to deal with those, we're talking about some of the systemic herbicides like Diquat, Reward, some of those products. And those products, when we're talking about submerged plants, we physically can't put the chemical like the glyphosate on the cattail, or we can't spray the water meal or duckweed and actually hit the plant itself because it's under the water. So we have to look at the label, and it will give us that we have to have so many parts per million, parts per billion. And what it'll say is it'll give you a use rate or an application rate based on acre feet of water. That's the big question I get with submerged vegetation. How do I know what my depth is? Well, the first thing you need to do in your pond is know how deep is your pond. Now, everybody that buys a pond in southeast Indiana, the guy who sells in the pond tells them it's 20 foot deep. There's maybe a handful of ponds in southeast Indiana that are 20 foot deep. I've actually physically seen one or two in my entire career of 28 years of doing this. Most ponds that they think are 28 feet deep are lucky to be 10 foot deep. And they say, well, look how deep the dam is. It's like 30 foot down to the bottom. Well, that doesn't mean on this side of the dam that's what kind of water you got. So I kind of had a youth pastor that I was ice fishing with that showed me this, and why I didn't think of this before, but when I was drilling holes for ice fishing, he went and got a tape measure and stuck them down the hole and drilled holes across the pond and walked on the ice, and now he knows what his pond layout is. You can take a piece of line, fishing line with a weight on it, put marks on it, but you need to know what your depth is, and you need to kind of map that out. So if we look at this pond here, we would want to come down this pond kind of in the middle and take average depths, because we don't have to be exact. This isn't an exact science. So if I figured that this pond, say, is 2 acres in surface area, and the average depth I got out there is about 8 feet, I would have 16 acre-feet of water. So if I was treating the entire pond for this weed, this submerged weed, I would base my treatment on 18 acre-feet of water. That's not exactly how we do this, because the weeds don't grow out there in the 10 or 12 feet. They're growing in a zone. So I think it's better for you to look at your pond and say, what's my zone look like? How far out are my weeds? So if they're 8 feet out from the bank, and I go out to the edge of that weed line, and I know that I've got 5 feet of water there, the average between that is maybe 3 feet, and then I kind of draw that little map out, and I determine that I've got an acre of weed zone in this 2.5 acre lake. Then I take that 2.5 feet times the acre, and I've got 2.5 acre feet, and I really just treat that zone. It's going to dilute over time because I didn't treat the whole pond, but that chemical should be in that zone long enough to be uptaken by that weed and get some good control. A lot of times the other thing about submerged weeds, it's not a one and done deal. As those weeds kind of die off and die down, they sprout back from a root system. A lot of the root systems have an ability to generate more plants. That's how they propagate. That's how they move. So you're looking at a couple treatments, but we want to get on it early in the spring, and then we want to stay on the window as it sprouts back. And if we keep that in control and in check in a pond, we can enjoy our pond, we can enjoy our swimming area or our beach, we can enjoy fishing without being hung up on weeds every time we make a cast. But we want some submerged weeds, but remember, you got to do a little calculating and figure out how much water we're treating. Treat according to the label directions. And most of those weeds in those labels will tell you what weeds, that chemical does and what rate for what weeds. So if you ever have a problem with weed identification, you can always pull some of those up. The fresher they are, the easier they are to identify. And send Aquatic Control or your local extension folks, send them a picture and we can figure out what your weed is, because knowing that weed can help us determine what the proper rate is for the submerged weeds.
I didn't see any other chat questions or anything, Dave.
Okay. All righty.
Well, hey everyone, this is John Hawley, your Ag and Natural Resource Educator in Dearborn County.
So I don't know what I just clicked on, but
I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're enjoying the weather. We cooled down just a little bit here, but still a lot of sun out, so
The next
mulching your gardens and working the land and maybe cutting some grass. You haven't got around to that yet. So there's
I don't know where.
going on. In fact, I'm here in my sunroom, and you can hear my neighbor. I think
Just
he's mowing
mute your
grass
computer, Dave. Hit the.
behind me here. So spring is here, and we're
Dave, I'm still here. You must have clicked on a separate video.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now I can't find where to turn it off.
But also in the beacon. Thanks again to the beacon for including our monthly lawn
Is
and
it
garden.
coming across
Hey,
your
Tom, the
laptop?
host
or
for a minute.
desktop?
That's the topic today. Is going to be garden planning 101. Whether you're a beginning gardener or you garden a lot longer than I have, there's obviously a lot of things that you need to plan.
I don't know what to do.
And I know
Dave, do you need to talk? Mute yourself.
Try the F1 button.
that have worked for me, that have worked for
F1?
gardeners that I
Yeah.
work with.
Tom, you should be able to unmute or mute Dave. There you go.
Questions, feel free to drop us a
But isn't he on his telephone?
There we go.
Yeah. I think he's on his telephone at work, so we may not get to hear him again unless he gets the computer turned off.
target, whether you're a big or a small gardener, but especially for those that are starting new, start small. So I'm at a brand new home here in beautiful Aurora, Indiana. My wife and I bought this home almost exactly a year ago. And I'm putting in a new garden.
So I don't know what.
Put in a lot of
Can you hear me?
no vegetable garden.
We can hear you, but we still hear John talking over the computer on the next video.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from.
Viral sketching and planning to figure out how I want to configure that garden, how I want it to be. So if
There must have been something crossed up in the recordings, Dave. Tom, you should be able to mute Dave.
just a little sheet of paper, write down your thoughts, maybe write down the dimensions of your garden.
There we go.
Yeah, I muted him, but now we won't hear him talking.
That's okay. Let me pull something up here.
Okay.
I wanted to plant my tomatoes.
We all in the very last video?
Whether you draw on a computer, you can go as advanced as you
He
like.
completed the last video, yes.
He concluded the last video?
Yeah, he
Choosing
concluded
the
it.
correct location can be important even for an existing.
Okay.
Now, we hear you, Dave, but don't hear the video, so you must have figured out something, or John figured it out.
I don't know what happened. That is the weirdest thing I've ever seen on Zoom. Thank you for everyone listening. We appreciate your patience.
All right.
So Dave, I don't know if you're back to where you can read the chats now. But Carrie asks how they have an issue with the sago pondweed and have used raking and weed treating without any luck. Our pond is shallow and about 1/4 to 1/3 of an acre. Any suggestions?
The sago pondweed, would probably be one of the like reward or dicot. The key on weeds like that is timing. You've got to get on them when those are just sprouting and they're young. If you wait until you see them kind of midsummer, they're already almost too old to control. So get on those plants early. As soon as you start seeing them grow up or green up, a good rule of thumb is generally the end of March, 1st of April time frame. Clipper and the propeller also has systemic control. If you were looking for a one jug deal to have as a small pond owner, look into the Clipper label and or propeller, that class of herbicide, because they have algal control, contact control, and systemic control. So if there is a one thing does it all, that product is kind of one of those products right now for us.
And Dave, I don't see anything else in the chat if someone wanted to add something, but I was thinking more after when we were talking about like organic methods and whatnot. I was thinking about the grass carp. They don't really like algae as much, do they? As really just the submerged grasses and weeds?
They'll eat algae. It's not their favorite. If you really have an algal problem, one of the things that I'll kind of end with is algae and plant growth and all that, especially our floating plants like duckweed and watermeal and our algae, planktonous algae, are there because of an influx of nutrients. And one of the things that we want to look at in a pond is we can keep throwing a Band-Aid at it or these chemicals at it and treat it. But if we can figure out how to limit that nutrient inflow to that pond, then we're going to have to do a lot less treating. And that may be a grass waterway, a buffer strip leading into the pond, a catch basin at the head of a pond if we've got a lot of water moving in, where we've got a little area that catches some of the sediment and soil and nutrients. And then every couple of years we can clean that catch basin out. So there are some other techniques we can use to limit the amount of fertilizer or fertility that gets in a pond. Another one of those is if we're treating our yard around a pond and we're weeding and feeding every time we try to put a weed killer on our lawn and we're using fertilizer year round, a lot of that fertilizer is ending up in our pond and causing some of our other problems. So kind of look at our other management on the land and see if we can't figure out a way to keep some of that nutrient from getting in the pond in the first place, and it'll really help us fix some of these situations.
Okay, so Carrie does ask, will the grass carp eat the sago pondweed?
They'll eat about any green weed. The problem with the grass carp is that they'll eat part of it, but they're not going to take it all the way out. And if they get to the point where they've cleaned all the vegetation out of a pond, they start acting like pigs and they start rooting on the bottom of a pond to eat the root systems. And they eat the plants as soon as they start coming out of the bottom. And what that can create is a very muddy pond situation. So you got to kind of be careful with grass carp. With all these different species, there are things that can kind of come along with them that are maybe unintended purposes. So if we put enough grass carp in there to take care of all the weed issues, then we could end up with a really muddy pond because now they're rooting on the bottom trying to find food. So you've got to kind of have a balance. And I think most of the time an integrated pest management system, maybe a little chemical control in the spring and then maybe using some of these biologics can be a good 1-2 punch where we reduce the amount of chemical we use, but we still, we still kind of have an integrated approach to our thing. And that's, with our tilapia study, that's really the direction we're going next year, to look at kind of an integrated system to how do we start a little cleaner, because we can't put tilapia in a pond until they're 60 degrees. And so sometimes we're already behind the 8 ball on a lot of our plant materials. So we're going to look at an integrated pest management system there too. So.
Okay, super. Any other questions for Dave or even for Wes, who is, we also want to thank Wes for contributing to those videos. And I don't know what all Dave's planning, but I know they'll be around for a while and be a good resource for other people to utilize too.
I'm going to share that PowerPoint with the videos. We have a couple in-person pond clinics, hopefully coming up in September. And I want to share that with educators as kind of a training. We were going to do an educator training, but I'm going to send that to educators to watch to maybe help give them the ABCs of that too. So.
Okay, and John Holly mentions that there are other videos could be found. You see that in the chat. Purdue Extension, YouTube.com, Purdue.
Yeah, just wanted to hop in real quick, Tom. It looks like on that last video, it just continued with our YouTube playlist. So sorry about that, but just wanted to thank Dave. Did a great presentation. And he's done this for a long, long time, folks. He's seen a lot of changes with ponds. He's pretty humble, so he won't say that himself. But he's seen the new management techniques. He's adapted to them. So Dave is always the best resource, especially if you're in Southeast Indiana. You can always reach out to me, Tom, anyone else in the area, but Dave's a good place to start with. And really go watch his other videos, because he's got some really great stuff on our YouTube channel. Okay,
I do see another chat question. Carrie Barron's asked, what do you think about ponds dug out and cleaned out? If you're going to renovate a pond, yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to do that. In that renovation process, if I'm going to clean a pond out and dig it out, I'm going to put cover in that pond. And what I mean by cover is I'm going to put some rock piles in that pond. I'm going to put some woody structure in that pond. The biggest thing I'm going to put in that pond is nesting structure. I'm going to find an area that's going to be 2 to 3 foot deep, and I'm going to put pea gravel, nesting areas. Most of our ponds, as they get mucked in and a lot of old aquatic slime on the bottom, we lose the ability of those bluegill to have a good nesting cover. So if I'm going to renovate a pond, I'm going to really look at putting some of those structures in. If you want to look at a resource or a video series on renovating ponds, John Scott of BASS, the Bass Pro developer, has a video series called Great Small Waters. So if you want to Google Great Small Waters, that's a really good video series for people thinking about renovating their farm ponds.
And kind of along with that, Dave, like a time frame, better than another?
Well, here's the deal. If you're going to get in there and actually move some of that slime and muck out, you're probably going to want to break that dam in the spring, and you're going to want to keep the water out of there so that the bottom can actually dry out enough to get equipment in there to do the work. And so you're probably looking at going ahead and knocking that out in the spring. Getting the work done in the summer when you got the dry months, reestablishing that dam and letting it start to fill through the winter. And then as the spring comes in again and it's starting to fill back up, then you can do the restocking and you know, reestablishing the fish and things like that in a pond. So it's going to take you about a year, plan on a year to do that, but you really, if you're going to get in there and move some soil around and dig that out, you're going to want to do that, you know, when you can dry it out in the summer. But here's one of the risks. We have very shallow bedrock in places, and if we start to dig a pond out and we get down to the bedrock and it's fractured bedrock, we can have just created a leaky pond. So you've really got to be careful on how we manage and clean out these ponds, because sometimes we can create a leaky pond out of a pond that never leaked if we get down in that bedrock. So.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're reading the chats, Dave, you're seeing a lot of thank you to you. And again, I'd add a thank you to Wes. And I don't know if John wants to say anything about this. Was the last in the 6th series of doing these webinars, and give folks, have folks give you a little bit of time, but you intend to get out a link to here's all the recordings, as well as probably a survey that we'd like participants to complete.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We want to thank everyone. A lot of people on the call today have attended a prior session. So if you submitted registration, we have your email. So we will be emailing you a link to the recordings here in the next few days, and also a link to a survey that our team is working on. We'll also be hosting more webinars and things coming up. So just thank you so much for tuning in. And once again, thanks to Dave. He's a great resource for ponds.
Hey, John, thanks for the video work and getting those videos done. I knew that took you quite a bit of time, and I appreciate the technical help.
Yep, and Wes put in the chat, always happy to help, so call Dave or him anytime you need help or have questions. Okay, thanks everybody.
All right, good night. Have a good evening.
And Dave, if you want to stop the recording, or you want me to?
I can do that.
Thank you all.
Good night, all. Thanks.
Thank you.